In this chapter, I am so pleased to welcome Stephen Greer, Senior Analyst at Celent, to discuss what today's core migrations are telling us about tomorrow's. Stephen, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us.
Good, Nina. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone at Mambu.
So one of the places I want to start, we've already discussed, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I saw that you wrote a blog post about where core migration is trending and where you see things going in the next few decades even. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found in that blog post?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I've been covering this space for quite a while, and it's always been with core that you could leave for a while, you could leave for a couple of years, and you could come back and not much had changed, right? Banks were still hanging on to their legacy technology. They were still, vendor platforms hadn't really changed that demonstrably. And what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is a really big change, even longer, right? Really 3 to 5, but it really culminated in the last 2 to 3, where you've started to see the emergence of a lot of new players in the space, really shaking things up. We've seen a lot of new technologies start to enter and really impact the thought process behind back office platforms. And so one of the things that I wrote last year, which was really interesting, was talking about in the industry, we've made a lot of predictions around where core would be heading, where core migrations would be heading, and that at some point there would need to be a tipping point. And these predictions have been being made for probably the last 20 years, right?
Yes, they have.
Yeah, and it hasn't yet really come to pass, and it's for a variety of reasons, right? A lot of the legacy technologies or existing incumbent cores have been really good at wrapping with middleware. And so, when online banking emerged and when mobile emerged, institutions could start doing a lot on the front end, but they could kind of ring fence and wrap their core system and not have to deal with it too much. But what we've seen over the last 2-3 years is that the kinds of technologies, the way in which the industry is headed is really incompatible with this approach, right? You have more banks leveraging the cloud native environments that emphasize composability, microservices enablement. You have open finance and open ecosystem types of plays, expanded third-party relationships that really require easier integration into customer accounts and customer records, reading and writing to those records. You have banking as a service and embedded finance, which really need granular composability of different functions and services. And then just the rise in payments volumes, the general rise of volumes of digital transactions within banking itself. So I kind of wrote this blog, and it's something that we've been thinking about internally, and which with a couple of trends emerging, and we've kind of visualized it as, to hang on to the total cost of ownership of core is increasing, right? And so the longer you hang on to a lot of these legacy platforms, the more you're having to engage in these types of workarounds to make sure that they still function in the way banking is moving, right? Which increases cost, it delays it decreases agility, it delays your ability to launch new products and services. And so, if you kind of think about it as a graph of total cost of ownership continues to inch up and becomes a bigger portion of IT spend for a lot of these organizations, the benefits of core are becoming more apparent. And what you get with a cloud native deployment is becoming more apparent, right? And at the same time, you kind of have the friction of migration reducing as you're able to more easily, and we can talk about this a little bit later in more detail, but as you're able to more easily start switching out different components or launch some kind of parallel core on the cloud and get up to running, the friction for migration is reducing. So if you kind of think about it, these two lines, TCO going up and friction going down for migration, at some point they overlap, and then you would get a tipping point, right, where you would start to see a surge and you'd start to see an increase in efforts because the the cost benefit analysis, right? The business case would be a little bit easier to justify and easier to make, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of think that this has happened, and that we've already reached this point, and that over the next 3 to 5 years, institutions are really going to start considering what they do with a lot of their back office platforms. And obviously it doesn't happen overnight. That's not how you can't migrate a core instantly. So it definitely will take time, but I think it's really given a lot of energy as well with some of the, let's say, more splashy announcements that have been made recently over
Absolutely.
the last few weeks and across a number of different geographies, right? But you have these really large institutions making sizable investments in core parts of their business for next gen core platforms or cloud native, even without cloud native, just core migration to something that's more modern, right?
Absolutely.
And it reminds me a lot of what happened at what, when I look at that, I see, okay, well, that could easily lead to a competitive domino effect where you see a large institution go all in on a modern core transformation. And then you see a cascading effect to its competitors who also say, okay, well, we can't wake up in 10 years time and be running a COBOL platform on a mainframe. We're going to be at a significant, severe competitive disadvantage. So all of a sudden you say, okay, well, maybe this is a risk we didn't want to take before, right? We didn't want to migrate because we didn't want to spend the money or we didn't want to take on the risk.
Yeah.
But our biggest competitor, at least in retail, is switching, and in North America, but this is it's happening globally.
Yep.
Is switching cores. We have to do something now, right?
Yeah.
And you saw this kind of take place in Australia 10 to 12 years ago, right? Where you had Westpac, you had NAB, you had all of them start switching, ANZ. They all within a short amount of time, all underwent core migrations to more modern platforms, and it was a little bit of co-evolution, which we believe is going to take place in definitely in North America, and I think has already started to take place in other markets.
Yeah.
Well.
Now, I want to touch on a few points that you mentioned about this tipping point. The first neobanks have been out for some time. I'm thinking as far back as Simple in the States. You've got, Monzo, Starling Revolut, well, all across the world, a lot of neobanks. And the pandemic also accelerated things. But if you're in this tech bubble, it feels like many of the traditional high street banks are still kind of resting on their laurels a bit and not quite running for a core migration at this moment. And we talked about it being a bit of a depreciating asset, right? So are the incumbents, are traditional banks actually losing market share right now? Or is that just a fallacy that we in the tech bubble think is happening?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a great point, and we can talk about this specific area, probably all day if we really wanted to. And I think that's the narrative that when you look at, I would look at it from the retail lens, right? And so there are certainly areas, lines of business, there are profit pools that are being challenged significantly by new entrants, by challengers, by fintech, right? But I think if you look at the retail space, challenger banks traditionally have been largely spending accounts. At least that's the hurdle that they've had to overcome, right? Is how do you get the primary banking relationship? But they've been traditionally more largely spending accounts, non-primary, especially for demographics that you want to go after, more profitable demographics with money, right? And a lot of this has to do with the fact that churn in banking is exceptionally low, right? Banking relationships are found to be extraordinarily sticky. Even if you look at like the UK, right, where regulations mandated ease of switching accounts, right? Account switching initiatives. You still had exceptionally low actual switching. And so, if you look at it, remember, like 90% of surveys that I've seen, around 90% of banking relationships come from your parents. And you end up, eventually, you take on the bank that your parents had.
Yep.
And then when churn does happen, or when customer acquisition happens, it's really when you start to need more complex financial needs, right? Like you're shopping around for a mortgage, or maybe you need an auto loan. And so the play is often to get in there as soon as possible, as young as possible, and then go from there. There have been challengers like Chime and Varo who do attract direct deposit relationships and have done a great job of growing from that. Or you have like Starling Bank that's done really well in the small business space.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Their banking as a service offerings. And these challengers are growing, and they're doing a really good job. But typically it's a specific demographic, or they're very much in the growth phase here. And so I think if you put this, you start to think about it in terms of traditional institutions versus challengers. I think another consideration here is when you look at advisory trust versus transactional trust, you see that traditional big brands, traditional banks have a huge amount of transactional trust.
Yeah.
And they're gaining advisory trust, right? There are consumer surveys out there that do show that consumers who are more digitally minded would like all of those capabilities from their incumbent bank or from their existing bank relationship, right? From the big brand that's been around for 100 years. And for a variety of reasons, they're not able to necessarily meet those needs for all kinds of reasons, which legacy transformation, all that stuff that we've talked about already. But there are some existing significant advantages that they have around regulatory expertise, around trust.
Absolutely.
That new entrants haven't yet necessarily forged and haven't necessarily gained. And so I believe that there's a lot of movement towards institutions to move in the direction of providing for those kinds of digital services, but for risk and for reasonable risk and kind of safety considerations, security considerations are moving, and technology considerations, right, are moving slower than they would probably like to. And they have high visibility into where they need to be. It's just the roadmap to get them there. So the question is, can the banks get there before the other challengers do? And some people in fintech, if you're in fintech, you're a VC, you'd say they can't get there, and the challengers are going to get there before them. And some incumbents in banking say, yeah, we'll get there because there's too many barriers for entry. There's too many barriers to entry for fintech, and the market moves slowly enough that eventually we'll get there. And at that point, we'll be able to retain our customer relationships, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where we kind of come down on it, is that banks are doing a lot. They're making a lot of investments. They're working within the confines the industry's provided for them, which is for the safety of the consumer and their money. Yep. And they're moving as fast as they can.
So perhaps actually it's more than just a core migration. Perhaps there's a bit of a cultural, a mindset shift, right, into really adapting this agile technology, if you will. And it's not just about becoming completely cloud native, but perhaps it's about using this ability that you've been given with cloud to be more agile, to, oh my goodness, speak to your customers and actually understand what is it that you want, where do you want to be met. But that all starts with a successful core migration. And we've talked about COBOL and the COBOL cowboys, and we've talked about your mainframe, but we've also talked about where you've seen some banks do it really well in Australia, right, where they all kind of migrated together. And we also know of stories where things perhaps didn't go so well with big bang transition. So I wonder, from your perspective, what does it take to have a successful core migration?
Yeah, no, and that's another great question, right? And I think when we look at it's an interesting space, right? Because we've seen banks that have undergone large scale rip and replace transformations of their core and have done it successfully, and but it's still it's extremely hard to justify, and probably will be a large 5-year transformation just because of the inherent cost and risk, right, to the organization. Now that calculus might change a little bit when larger banks start to do this, but it's still it's not something that C-level boards want to undertake, right? Shareholders are uneasy about it just because the ROI is so long, and so and most core migrations go over cost and time. And
Understatement.
so yeah, exactly. So there are not a lot of great examples out there. We've written about a few, but there are not a lot of great examples out there of a migration that's really of a traditional institution's entire technology, back office technology landscape, a successful migration without kind of any hiccups. It's just part of it. It's just too complex, right? However, I think there are a couple different factors that are easing the pain here. And first, I think is just pure composability, and we've talked about this before, right? Is just the ability to start swapping in and out components, right? And this is as technology becomes more granular, and as platforms are moving towards more granularity in functions and services, it's obviously it becomes easier to start switching out different aspects of it, right? Moving functionality out of the back office core and into either middle layer for like pricing, relationship-based pricing, billing, those kinds of things that institutions are moving out of the core that make composability a little bit more approachable. I think a big area here is how progressive renovation has evolved. And so, you used to have where if you looked at either a big bang migration or progressive renovation, progressive renovation, at least traditionally in kind of an on-premise environment, you're running another license, you're running new infrastructure, you're running separate hardware, dedicated resources. And so you de-risk the effort significantly, but you also increase costs significantly. And so that was prohibitive for a lot of organizations that might have wanted to do that, right? Or might have been evaluating a transformation. With a cloud native approach, it changes a little bit, right? Because the approach is more you're paying per use. Your progressive renovation becomes more about standing up maybe a small sliver of a platform in a cloud native environment that you're paying per use. It's easier to get going. It's easier to integrate. The resources that are needed, dedicated, are largely outsourced to either infrastructure providers or the vendor themselves, right? For things like maintenance and ongoing upkeep. And so you start to see that to just stand something up that could be a path to migration is a lot less prohibitive from a cost perspective.
Absolutely.
And it's a lot quicker and faster to do. So, when you talk about like time to value to start getting something up and running and into production and getting customer accounts over to it, it becomes a lot less, there's a lot less friction involved, right? And becomes more approachable. So banks of all sizes are starting to do this, even small community banks up to the large tier ones are starting to take this kind of approach. And I think that really, as far as looking at something that would enhance your ability to successfully migrate customers over and undergo a core transformation, I'd say that approach is becoming one of the more popular.
Well, that is brilliant. You heard it here first. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I know you and I could go on for hours and hours about this topic, but thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for tuning in to this chapter, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the Mambu Summit chapters.